This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, do we have any questions? Let's be this gentleman down there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was just wondering about the idea of national archives, really, and some of the comments that were made in these papers were about the differences, really, in the status of national archives and official collections in different parts of the world. And I was just wondering, in your own work, but perhaps in National Archives, the chair might want to comment as well, whether there are attempts now to kind of bring these different national collections from different parts of the world together, because my own experience is that the Kew stuff, for instance, is of a particular kind, and then you go to the National Archive somewhere else, and actually you get different layers of documents. And so it'd be very interesting to know, in relation to colonial documents, but diplomatic documents as well, whether in your own work, but also from the perspective of the National Archives, what is being done to integrate these different sources up.
Okay. As far as I know, I don't work on that side of the National Archives, on the collections side, but the collections that they have, I think, are seen as discrete collections. There is liaison between all the National Archives and meetings and so on. And there's an international council on archives where sort of issues are discussed about collecting. But as far as the National Archives collections itself are concerned, I think they're seen as a discrete product. Interestingly enough, though, there is a group called the IRO group, research organisation group, which a couple of the speakers here, Catherine Souch, who you heard this morning, and JD Hill, who you'll hear in the next session, are members on. And actually one of the things we're going to be discussing at our next meeting is the idea of the national collection. So it's something that's definitely on the agenda, so quite interesting to hear you raise it as an issue.
The migrated archive that was mentioned in the previous session is actually an interesting insight into that difference, because of course now it's become very clear, anyone that's interested in Kenya's decolonisation history that wants to write from the sorts of materials that habitually have been used in Kenya actually has to come to Kew, which is an interesting byproduct of that process. I will, just as obviously, as you were saying, sort of joining things up and digitisation and all these things are obviously helpful to historians, but I think we're showing a little bit of a lack of ability to look forward and think about some of the potential risks to this. And as someone who has worked in the past on Kenya, the Kenyan National Archive will cease to exist if people stop walking through its door. There just isn't the resources to sustain an institution that won't be used. And we have to be careful about this rush towards digitisation. I mentioned it in passing in a joking fashion at the end of the first session. It was incredible to hear this enthusiasm for digitisation on the part of archivists, when everything else we know about digitisation in other areas of life is that it normally means the erosion of the specialist knowledge and that sort of hands-on personal individual. So I think there's also, I know it's somewhat off the point, but there is as we think about bringing things together and access and all these questions, there is something here to think about the long-term sustainability of both history as a discipline and archivists as a profession as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd actually echo what you say about the archives. I mean, some of my research for the PhD was in Senegal, and so the French National Archives are an interesting counterpart, because they're the sort of archival decentralisation, like Japan in the sense where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of the Colonies all have their separate archival repositories. But when the French left French West Africa, they repatriated microfilms of the political affairs files which they thought were most relevant to them to go forward. So you can do the work in Paris, but then most of the archives remain in Dakar, in Senegal. And actually that is an enormously important resource for African graduate students, African undergraduate students to do their own work, as well as for visiting scholars from Europe, from France, from Britain, from the US, elsewhere in North America. So I think sort of, I agree entirely that sort of, should those archives lose their sort of, their rationale, that would be a very sad thing. But the point I was trying to make at the end of the last of my paper was, when those archives are inaccessible for whatever reason, then there has to be a backup plan, a contingency plan, as Naoko put it, sort of a backup archive. And how we do that, I mean, the digital does offer possibility of doing that while also bringing about some losses, definitely. But I agree entirely, sort of, especially, I mean, African archives, but also some other Asian archives, I imagine.
Well, just to add to Daniel and Andrew, I think the thing about decentralized ministerial archives is that in the case of Japan, for example, they seem to form different rules in different ministries. So the foreign ministry, they claim that they're the most liberal ones. And so at the moment, since 2012, they have this incredible policy where you can, because they define the archival materials as belonging to the people of Japan. So anybody can access, and you can take digital copies of whatever you wanted to without any permission. And it's really quite incredible. It's currently the most open one that I've ever been to. But they also tell me that once the Ministry of Finance, which is the key ministry with budget, holding the budgetary power, when they start sort of wanting to kind of re-centralize all these ministerial archives, then these liberal measures which are in place at the moment will likely to be taken away again. So there are there's quite a lot of politics, obviously, behind the accessibility idea.
One last thing, kind of to go back to Sujit's point, the National Archives in Lebanon were mainly a business archive. There were business trading families, which is, don't know what that says about Lebanon, but it's interesting.
It's interesting that, and Sujit's question, I think, reflects this, that all three of you, your orientation has been very much towards state archives. And although, as Andrew just said, that may mean, in fact, private individuals. I wonder if you could say something about, maybe from your own experience, or maybe more broadly, about doing global history in non-state archives in the UK, because Naoko mentioned private papers that she looked at in the States, many of which are in university archives. But of course, in this country, there are lots of private papers in local archives. And I mean, if I think of my own career, I mean, I've written, I was working recently on Geoffrey Gorer, who was an anthropologist, sort of, and principally known for writing about how the English feel about sex. But he also did field work in the Himalayas in the 1930s, and in his private papers at the University of Sussex, there is this vast, I think, I didn't really read through them, but there's this vast store of materials on the Lepcha people in the Himalayas in the early 20th century. And those kinds of things and places are not the natural resort of historians, who naturally gravitate to the state archives first. And of course, you know, now we have digitized searching aids. It's much easier to find archives in all sorts of out-of-the-way places, but we don't necessarily know where this non-local content lies in those archives, because it's not even obvious sometimes, even from the high level of digitization of catalogs that we get. So I'd be curious to hear more from any of you about these more out-of-the-way places.
No, I mean, that's absolutely right. And I think sort of for those who work on the Middle East, I mean, I guess depending on where you work, what part of the Middle East you work on, sort of the first place you might go to might be, you know, Asia and Africa Reading Room, the old India Office Library. If you're working on the Gulf, it would be the Middle East Centre at St Antony's. At Oxford, it would be the Durham Papers, the Sudan Papers in Durham. So all these private collections, I mean, the Royal Commonwealth Society as well, I mean, depending on what one does, the Royal Geographical Society, the papers we had this morning, I mean, certainly sort of a constellation of different archives, different repositories, private papers all across the country, which are an invaluable resource, actually. And sort of with undergraduate dissertation students, even sort of the first port of call will often be, the first place I send them would be St Antony's, and looking at private papers of particular administrators, as well as going to Kew and looking at what the Foreign Office or Colonial Office has. I mean, that's absolutely right, yeah.
I think in my case, the private papers I looked at in this country, they were at the House of Lords Records Office, which was brilliant. Bodleian, Cambridge, University of Cambridge, British Libraries. But with this current project on Bandung, I'm very interested in looking at newsreels, that sort of visual materials from the British Film Institute, for example, which I'm sure they have loads of very interesting stuff. And also National Portrait Gallery has an incredible amount of particularly photographic sources to do with key individuals, and a lot of people I'm looking at are quite famous individuals. So I'm expecting to find, these kind of more visual materials in other UK archives, which are non-state.
They're not the archives of the state.
Yeah, they're not the archives.
Can I just come in and comment on that? Because I did my PhD on business, culture and empire in the late 19th and early 20th century, and I used very few state archives. I used a lot of business archives. I used BP's archives. I used Barclays archives. I used Unilever's archives. I used the UAC collection. But I also used things like the RAF Museum, who held the papers of Lord Trenchard, who, as well as being the father of the RAF, had also been chairman of Unilever, which is one of the companies I looked at. I looked at the special collections in Birmingham, because they had the Cadbury papers, who'd done a lot of cocoa growing in West Africa. And I also used the Cambridge University and Oxford University Careers Service archives to look at the kind of people they were recruiting, because I wanted to look at the culture of the people who were going out there. So I agree with Peter. I think if you use a bit of lateral thinking and a bit of creativity and imagination, and again, sort of going back to what Mike was mentioning and several people were mentioning this morning, it's about looking more creatively at some of the sources that are available, and also to pick up the points about you trying to get away from the sort of mono perspective of state and national archives, and to look more widely.
That is something which isn't replicated elsewhere, and on James' team. I think we ought to...
Would you like the microphone to come down to you so that people can hear?
I think we ought to bring that into the equation here. Peter Mandler's raised a very important point here about the context in which we approach global history. We have the National Register of Archives, which is the central source for non-state records, in which you can find an enormous amount of material, both here in the UK and elsewhere. Now, there are other National Registers of Archives in other Commonwealth countries and some European countries. I'm not aware of what the situation is in the Far East, but it does help us to balance the story of the state of any historical enterprise by looking at private sources as opposed to the records generated officially by the state. So I would encourage people to use that, and the NRA indexes are being added to Discovery, so they will be available along with the public records at Kew, but they are already available online to you. So don't forget that, and the fact that we are ahead of the game here in the UK in making that material available. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's a question down here at the front. Joe, there's a woman at the front who's been waiting for a few minutes. I think we've probably just got time for one more after that.
I think it was Daniel that made the comment that writing imperial histories from the UK archives sometimes just reveals one side of the narrative. And I just wondered what you thought, as a panel, in terms of when we're talking about global histories, to what extent do you think collaborating with sort of local historians on the ground, or even historians here that are based here, that are Kenyan or Nigerian, etc., how that would perhaps enrich your practice and our interpretations as well, because obviously they bring that. So, and I don't know if that's something that the funding bodies often encourage as well. And also, the last professor spoke about the visa and permits that can be impediments, and I think that's a major thing for, obviously, scholars coming from abroad, and even PhD students who are working here and might have their own impediments while they're here, and obviously they have to go back and they have to make major decisions as to how long they can stay, and that has an impact on, can have an impact on the quality of their scholarship as well. So just wondered if you could say something about that.
I agree with the sentiments behind the statements entirely. One of the points you raised, which actually comes back into everything we're saying, is about actually collaboration is an essential part of doing global history, both in this country and with colleagues in other countries. I just also want to pick up on the final comment you made as well, and I'm glad you raised that, about the difficulties of getting, and I'll speak from experience, African-based scholars into the UK through the visa system is extremely hard. But there's also, and this isn't meant as a criticism, because we've all gone and travelled to countries on tourist visas and so on, but there is also a point here about research permits. Certainly, again, I'll talk for the country I know best. Kenya, the revenue from research permits is overwhelmingly actually shared with the host institution that sponsors you. And I suspect that's a very common picture in a number of locations. And it's actually one of the very few ways these institutions can raise extra much needed resources. So I stress I'm not trying to come over, I take the moral high ground on this position because I've done exactly the same things. But it is something one of the things that struck me from moving away from sort of doing a narrow sort of national history is how hard global history is. In terms of visits, in terms of the way in which your engagement with any one location is so much more fleeting. So I think Sujit made the point in the first presentation, the first panel, about the need to go to places. And I agree wholeheartedly, but of course, every time you add another node to your network of places you're studying, this becomes increasingly more and more difficult, and the time you can ever spend there is increasingly difficult. But I think the issue of research permits, about mobility of scholarship, I think are very, very important themes to think about. And this isn't just moral, but it's also very practical considerations that impact upon the work we do.
I'd echo Daniel entirely, and also sort of going back to something I mentioned earlier, which is the work of graduate and undergraduate students in Africa and in the Middle East. And I think, unfortunately, there is a tendency not to collaborate, but to use that work, sometimes in very unethical ways, actually, but to use it sort of as a mine itself, sort of just somewhere to kind of plumb information from, but not really to engage with. Well, and I think that's another danger, sort of to come in, pitch up at these places, go through a library, take all the MA theses, and kind of use those. And it is an unfortunate trend, I think, amongst some scholars, but I think it's something that we need to be wary of as well. Sort of that if there is engagement, it has to be on genuine terms of collaboration, and not sort of this practice that I've seen in certain places. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we won't have time for any more questions, but thank you very much, and if we could thank our speakers once again. It's been a great session.
They know it's tea.
Oh yes, sorry. Oh right. Despite the doors being shut because they'll have to keep the protesters out, we do now have a tea break, but we only have 15 minutes. So if you could keep to the time and get back, that'd be we'd be very grateful. Thank you.